for the fourth and final episode of our forward planning, succession planning program. My name is Karen Goldner. I'm the Managing Director of Established Business Services at the Women's Business Development Center based in our Chicago office. I want to also recognize Cynthia Johnson from our Chicago office and Sarah Brook from our Twin Cities office who are joining us here today. And we have a little bit of a slight change in the program today. Bridget Foster, who is our Director of Certification, is recovering from a terrible virus or something, I don't know. Anyway, she coughs all the time and she can't talk. So she sends her regrets, but I will be here, and we have an amazing guest in Michelle Cantor. If you want to go ahead, Sarah, and put the welcome slide up, just because I do want to recognize a couple of our sponsors, Barnes & Thornburg and Eisner Amper, who have, as I think many of you seem familiar, and you've been at the previous programming, who've just done an amazing job of talking about succession planning. And then, as I mentioned today, we will have another attorney, Michelle Cantor from McDonald Hopkins in the Chicago area, joining us. The program is being recorded, and it will be shared along with contact information for Michelle and Bridget and myself to everybody who registered. And then we are going to be putting all of the recordings up on our website. So if you lose the link later, you can find it on our website. As you'll recall, we've talked about really two different ways of looking at succession planning. We've looked at internal options, which is selling essentially to people you know, right? Management, family members. We've sort of mentioned ESOPs a little bit. External options, selling to people you don't know. So strategic buyer, some unrelated buyer, and some private equity situations. In either of those scenarios, or in any of those scenarios, what that means for your WBENC, WBE certification, and potentially other certifications that your business might have that might be government related or minority business related and so forth. Any of those changes are going to impact your certification. So that's why we are here today. So if you want to, I think we can go ahead and just let me introduce Michelle Cantor and ask her to introduce herself. And then she and I will kind of have a conversation. And so Michelle, please go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll start chatting. And we will do Q&A at the end.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Cantor. I'm a partner at McDonald Hopkins law firm. We're a national firm. We have, I think now, 6 offices nationwide. And I am the chair of our government procurement practice group, where I do certification work. I've been doing this for about 30 years or more, doing WBE, MBE, DBE, SDB, OSB, 8A, Hub Zone, every certification and appeals on this earth. And I do it for companies nationwide. I'd say about 80% of my clients are women business owners, and they have multiple certifications, and they're all over the country. And my passion is advocating for women businesses. I am on the board of directors for WBDC, and I am proud to be on that board of directors. They're an awesome organization. My firm we're a full service firm, so we do everything from real estate work to patents and copyrights, et cetera. A lot of corporate mergers and acquisitions. So I have mergers and acquisition team for our more complicated transactions. And I also do a lot of federal government work in terms of bid protests and size protests and helping people navigate through federal government and as well as local government regulations.
Thank you. As we get started, I want to just kind of frame the certification requirements generally. I mean, you're all certified, so you sort of know this, but it might be long enough ago that you've forgotten some of it. And this stuff plays itself out in succession planning. Certification covers ownership. So, right, 51% of the company must be owned by a woman, unrestricted. It includes legal control, so your governance documents. So if you maybe were the 100% owner, and it doesn't really matter what your bylaws say in real life because you're the only owner, but you give 1% to Fred, then all of a sudden unanimous consent issues can be a problem. And then also operational control, which is expertise, independence, that kind of thing. So Michelle, let's just talk about some of the actions that an owner could take that would compromise their certifications. What are some of the things you've seen?
Well, owners take actions, and we'll just talk about existing women businesses that have certifications. They might change ownership where they start through succession planning or otherwise, they start giving ownership, gifting, or selling ownership to their children. They might want an infusion of capital, and so they sell to outside parties and bring in a 49% owner, or they sell to their employees, and they don't necessarily do it the right way. So if there's any change of ownership, any change in control, there could be a decertification. Then there's something called affiliation. And affiliation is a bad word in terms of municipal, state, as well as federal certifications, because if you, and that a lot of times it will have to do with common ownership and control. So for instance, if you allow another company owners to come in and own a portion of your firm because you need that equity infusion, they see that as an affiliation. They'll add your gross receipts together with both firms, and you're no longer a small business, which could impact many of you who are also DBE certified and WOSB certified, and certified, for instance, in the city of Chicago or city of LA or Minneapolis. So
let me interrupt you a minute and stop and let's try to unpack some of this, because you just have said a lot. And all of these things that you've said really are in the context of minority ownership. So this is still, Karen still owns 51% or more of the business, right? It's just that my son, Joe, now owns some stake, or I've sold a minority, 49% or less to, Acme Enterprises, which is an affiliated business. So I want to just call that out for folks. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is sort of a two-step transition process, which can allow you to keep your certification. But you still need to make sure, I guess, several things. One is with respect to the affiliation agreement or the affiliation issue, which Michelle just talked about, which really impacts more government certifications, because in terms of WBENC, there's no limit on how big you can be, right? But we do look at, are you still running the business? And are you running it independently of that affiliate company, right? That's the minority investor. So that's an issue. We would look at that. We would look at it as an operational issue, whereas the government is just going to look at it as a size issue and may kick you out just entirely. But the other thing that we see a lot is, and I'm just going to, I see Terry's picture on the screen, so I'm just going to use Terry as the example. So if Terry has been the 100% owner of her company, her operating agreement or her bylaws are almost irrelevant, right? Because she owns 100% of the company. So if there's a unanimous consent provision in her bylaws, which say that, all of the owners have to agree on certain decisions, then it doesn't matter. If Terry's the 100% owner, we don't care. Or if Terry and Susie own the company together, Susie's female, so then that's fine. But if Terry brings in her son, Joe, right, as the 2% owner or something, I mean, it's not like he has to have any amount of significant ownership, but then we need 100% of the owners. We need unanimous consent under the bylaws, right? Then all of a sudden, Terry doesn't have control of that business anymore, because Joe can say, no, I don't think we should borrow money. I don't, whatever, So those are things you really have to start paying attention to. The fact that you've been certified doesn't necessarily mean that you can stay certified even by bringing in minority owners. So that's something to just be aware of. Okay, Michelle, go ahead and keep going. You're saying a lot, which is great. I just want to make sure that people have time to digest it, because it's great information.
Right. There also, I can give you a few examples. But
yeah, please do. Let's talk about some horror stories.
I could give you a lot of horror stories, but one example I want to talk to you about is when you do make these changes, you need to look at your certifications. What certifications are most important to you? Maybe you don't care anymore about size. You don't want to be in the government market, and so you just want to be in the supplier diversity market. Then that's fine. But if you do care, and you have to understand that there are major differences in WOSB certifications, that's the federal market, DBE certifications, and WBE certifications. And here's an example. In the WBENC allows for you to own your stock in an irrevocable trust, okay? All the other agencies say that that stock must be owned by US citizens. And the only example is if your stock is in trust. But if your stock is in trust, you must be the grantor, the trustee, and the beneficiary. And they don't allow for irrevocable trusts. So if your estate planner is doing estate planning and he makes an irrevocable trust, you can kiss your other certifications goodbye. Yeah. And so that's just one example. Another example is ownership, gift ownership. And so the DBE regulations, basically, they don't allow, especially males to gift their stock to females and the males to remain in that company in any capacity whatsoever. They also have something called real and substantial ownership. WOSB, SBA doesn't really care how much a woman paid for her stock, but the DBE regulations certainly care. And they give examples saying, you paid $100 to buy into a $10 million company. That's not real and substantial. To us, that's a red flag. So every agency has their red flag indicators. And what I try to do to help my clients structure their proposed transaction is give them an example of what is when they tell me, oh, in this scenario I want to do this, and I'm like, that will be a red flag to the agencies, because that shows that you're losing control or there's negative control upon your company.
Yeah, one of the sort of success story examples that I'm going to talk about is it's a construction related company in the Chicago area. I think it's maybe $5-6 million company. So not teeny, but not huge. It was 100% owned by a woman. I'll call her Sally just to make it less confusing. That's not her name. And Sally had owned the company for a long time. Sally's son and daughter-in-law worked in the business, but the daughter-in-law, who I will call Mary, Mary just basically did the bookkeeping. Mary really wasn't involved in, the strategic or the management of the company or anything. But she worked there, but she didn't have a lot of experience. So Sally and I spoke about a year and a half before Sally decided she wanted to retire. And Sally said, my plan is to turn it over to my daughter-in-law. So we talked about two important things. One was, in the context specifically of this transaction, making sure that Mary was given the opportunity to learn and grow and have more responsibility in the business so that a year and a half hence, when the transaction occurred, Mary could credibly show that she, could run the business. The other is this, I'll just call it this two-step process. And this is something I really want to make sure that folks know. This works for WBENC. I don't know, Michelle, you can talk after a bit about whether it works in the government space. So let's just say we're back to Terry, and Terry is going to sell her interest in the business to Janie, okay? And this is in the context of Terry wanting to move to Florida. So Terry is going to want out entirely at the end of this transaction. But right now, Terry owns 100% of the business. So she's going to sell 1% of the business to Janie, okay? And then she's going to turn in a material change to WBENC, and she's going to say, now Terry owns 99% and Janie owns 1%. Here's proof that Janie is female. This is Janie's resume, yada, yada, yada. And we're going to assume for a moment that Janie knows what she needs to know in order to run Terry's company. So then that takes 6 weeks because it has to go to committee. And that's fine. And in the meantime, Terry's WBE certification continues to be in force. Then after that period, and it can be right away, or it could be the next year or whenever Terry wants to, then Terry is going to turn over the other 99% of the business to Janie, okay? And so then at that point, Janie's going to file, or the company will file another material change and say, now Janie owns 100% of it. So we went from Terry owning 100 to Terry owning 99 and Jane owning 1. and now Jane owns 100. And during that whole time, the certification for the company remains in force. Whereas if Terry had just woken up one morning and said, okay, Janie, now it's, today's the day, and we're going to go from 100% Terry to 100% Janie, WBENC says we have to decertify when Terry has sold the business, regardless of the fact that Terry has sold it to another woman. So that transition path is really important. I would say that we've had at least one situation I'm aware of where, because a female family member owned 1% of the business, when there was an unexpected death, that company was able to remain certified. So in the context of, obviously great personal tragedy, at least they didn't have to worry about certification. Because a female family member owned 1%. So I don't know, Michelle, whether that's a strategy that works in the space.
One or two of the scenarios you and I talked about, I was involved with.
And
what we recommend, especially if women business owners are looking to retire and with COVID and everything else, everybody change your succession plans immediately in different ways, is you make sure that if you are planning on transferring to your daughters or other women relatives, that you do it at least partially while you're alive, especially if you are older or in ill health. And we will recommend that, either by gift, so you could take advantage of the gift estate taxes right now, or by a sale, even if a portion of the stock. So there's always, because what you don't want, and I've seen this happen, is that God forbid something should happen to you and everything goes into probate. And when it's in probate, nobody owns your company. There is no woman owner. That triggers an immediate certification. So you want to at least have that in place, and whoever that 1% woman owner is, and hopefully she's trained and has enough expertise about the company that can, handle this until the estate is taken care of properly. And she could, and by default, she becomes 100% owner because the then current owner is deceased.
Michelle, can you talk about how a trust would play out in a kind of a WBENC scenario? So the company is owned by the McNally Family Trust, and then something happens. Then how does that work?
Well, if the company wouldn't be owned by the trust unless it was this. So you have
if the stock says, whatever, Cantor Family Trust on it.
Right. Well, then that could be automatic if the woman was a trustee, beneficiary, and grantor, and the succeeding or the contingent, basically the executor and the next in line is another woman. I just dealt with a fairly complicated situation in Arizona where it was a Native American owned 8A firm. And the wife had been involved in the business, and she helped start the business 30 years ago. And she grew up on the reservation, but she wasn't Native American, but she grew up on the reservation. So what happened is that he had like a pour-over will. So it was a pour-over trust. So what had happened is that upon his death, she was named the executor, and she was also the beneficiary of all that stock. So while he owned the stock during his life, is the minute he died, it triggered her ownership, and that was immediately. And then we just notified the SBA. We proved that she had she had also economic and social disadvantage. They didn't cancel her 8A contracts, and it was a more seamless type of an ownership change. We had to answer a lot of questions and present materials to show that she had the expertise and knowledge to control her company, but it worked, and they were able to keep their contracts as well.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, can you talk about maybe any examples in the context of selling to an investor? And this is probably going to be more on the WBENC side than, but whatever, and how that how that plays out.
Well, what I find is that when there are private equity investors involved, what the most important thing they want is control. They want a seat at the board of directors. They want, if they can't have, voting stock, they want preferred stock. They want their dividends first. They want priority. Sometimes they wanted something called convertible stock, where they're infusing money into the company, but then they want additional stock at their option, which would basically, WBENC would say no, because that's an option to get stock in the future, which would compromise the certification. And it also means negative control. And I'm telling you, a lot of private equity investors will not, they won't budge. I mean, you have to negotiate very hard with them, and they bring me in to explain the regulations to them and say, look, no can do. If you want to play in the MBE, WBE world, you got to play by their rules. And their rules are that women must control the company, and you can't have control over the women. And some of them will back down because they know what the income potential is, and some of them won't. It really depends on who those investors are and how they really, and one way to do it is show them, look at, this is how important my WB certifications are. I make $15 million in revenue, and probably 12 million is from my WBE certification. So if you want that continuity of revenue, we're going to keep that WBE certification at all costs.
Yeah, we had a situation where a long certified company took on, and she had some kind of 1%, 2% owners along the way, but it had not ever been a problem. They'd been mostly employees or whatever. But then without us knowing it, she took on an investor who, gave her a new set of bylaws, and there was a problem. And so but she'd already taken the money. She'd already signed the bylaw. I mean, she'd agreed to all of these terms. She just didn't understand what she was doing. So then we looked at it, and WBENC has a process, if you're currently certified, that will, and so when you renew your certification and you send us, your new stuff and say, oh yeah, we took on, Acme Investment Company, and they now own 15%, and here's our bylaws. If there's a problem, then WBENC gives you 60 days to cure the problem. And so we work with you, and I mean, don't freak out about that 60-day period. I mean, we would work with you to try and make sure. Now, if you lapse your certification in the middle of it, then it just lapses and you're uncertified for a while, inactive. But so in this situation, and to Michelle's point, the certification was important enough that she was able to go back to this investor and change the terms of the deal. You should not count on that being always the case, right?
Right. And Karen, I'll tell you, I've done those, people have come to me and say, Michelle, that weren't my clients before, I got decertified or pending decertification because of this. And I'll say, okay, we got to undo that transaction. But if there's no money to undo the transaction, that's a problem. Or if you've got a bank loan and a bank, you want to buy out your investors, those bank covenants say you cannot use your, company funds to buy out those investors. You have to use your own funds to do it. So, and then also, if it's in between tax years and you've already filed a tax return that these investors are part owners, that can make it complicated. So if you're working with a corporate attorney, make sure they understand certifications, or you guys hire a separate consultant or use WBENC to understand what could possibly go wrong, because it's not that easy to undo a transaction, and investors don't necessarily like it. But we've seen it. I've seen it happen several times, and so has Karen. It does get it can get done.
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't count on it. And I do not know the nature of the relationship after that between this woman and her investor. I can't imagine that it got better from that circumstance. We have a couple questions. So Amanda asks about, does the 1% woman owner in this transaction, the transition that I talked about, have to pay something, or can it be gifted? And Michelle, do you want to talk about that? You mentioned it a little bit, but I think it's an important topic to talk more about.
Well, it really depends on if the second woman owner is an employee. If the second woman owner is an employee and you're gifting it to your employee, the IRS does not look at that as a gift. It is actually income, and it will be taxed. And a lot of people make that mistake. Now, if you gift it through inheritance to an employee, that's a different story. And what I think in my I only have to interpret doing certifications for, with my clients with WBENC and other agencies, is that they like to see where women have skin in the game. And, I'm using you, Terry, as an example. Terry is you as an example. Meg is you as an example. All of you as examples. You've worked hard to grow your company. And if some woman's going to come into this company and just put in $4, which could also be a problem with the IRS, it's like you want them to have skin in the game. And if they don't, and I've seen fathers sell to daughters, like in Karen's, the one Karen circumstance you and I talked about earlier, and another one where, I have at least 5, probably in the last few years, where dads were retiring and sold their companies for a lot of money to their daughters. Why did they do it? Well, they did it because they wanted income into the future when they retire. And number 2, they wanted those daughters to have skin in the game, as opposed to just a gift where they could just go fly off to Hawaii and, spend the year there. So it's not a bad thing. And, there's ways to do it as well, because you can give a gift through and still take advantage of the tax exemption, the gift tax exemption to your daughter. Maybe it's a special occasion or something like that. And then they can turn around and give it back to you by a purchase, she purchases that stock from you. It's not required. You can give it by gift, especially under the WBENC rules. But once again, I always find that all my certifications go through much more smoothly, where I show that there's women who they had other women buy into it. Now, I also do partial gifts and sales, so I want to, what we'll, a lot of times we'll do is the woman will buy, let's say 10%, and then the rest gets gifted through time, through a succession plan. So the next year, I'm going to gift you X amount of money all the way till when I retire in 5 years. So there's a lot of scenarios.
Yeah, and I think that you want to think about it in maybe 3 different buckets of topic. The first is tax, right? And Michelle's talked about some tax ramifications. So that's a thing you need to talk about with your CPA, your tax advisor. The second is WBENC. The third is government certifications, right? So from a WBENC perspective, we would generally accept, we would always accept a family gift, right? I got it from dad, well, lucky for you, but that's fine. We would consider that to be acceptable. If it's an employee gift, we probably would sort of look at the employee, the new owner as, contributing expertise. And so we would say that would be fine. But on the government side, then, as Michelle has talked about, they're a lot more specific about, what that you're not paying $4 for $20 million worth of stock or $200,000 worth of stock.
Even in a WBENC scenario, if very much like the DOT regulations for DBE, if a dad gives the stock to his daughters, but is still running the company and still has,
exactly, yeah.
WBENC is, you guys don't like that, and I don't.
No. That's for sure. Yeah, I'm really talking specifically about the use case where a company is currently WBENC certified, owned, operated, controlled, and managed by a woman or women, and then what happens next? Yeah, because you're exactly right. And the thing that Michelle and I, this specific example that she and I were talking about earlier, was the daughters, the two sisters, paid a lot of money to the father for the business, and he still wanted to maintain all this control. That if 2 random strangers had purchased the business from this guy, they would never have agreed to, So those were issues that needed to be resolved before they could be certified in the first place. Veronica asks, is being chairman of the board of directors considered operational control? She's currently CEO, and she's considering retiring and appointing a male CEO. I want to talk about WBENC for this, and then ask Michelle to talk about government certifications. So the answer to this is kind of twofold, and it, like all questions, it entirely depends, right? So the first issue we would look at is we would look and see, what do the bylaws of your company say is the highest title, Veronica? So is the chairman of the board the superior title, or is it basically just the responsibilities of the chairman are to run the meeting? If the responsibilities of the chairman are to run the meeting, then we would not deem that to be the highest title. But if it's more of a chairman who's truly, above the CEO in the sort of organizational chart of the bylaws, then it would be potentially okay. Then the second thing would be, what is the day-to-day operation of the business? So if by chairman of the board, you mean you're living in Florida and you Zoom on for a meeting a couple times a year, we might not really see that you're having a lot of control over the business. So you don't necessarily need to be in the office every day, but you need to be showing that you are exercising some, leadership and control over the business, if that makes sense. Michelle, where would that play out on the government certification side?
Well, exactly what you said, but it's all in really so for instance, if your bylaws say, just chairman of the board, and that's all it says, but the president is running the daily operations. The daily operations means operational control. And agencies do not like that, because they actually, it's in their regulations. They say that who runs the daily operations. And if you're not running those daily operations, you're not in control, and they don't want you in those government programs. The other thing is looking at for instance, does the president report directly to the chairman of the board? Does a report on a daily basis, on a weekly basis? What type of decision making? For instance, if that president has to go to the board and say, I want to hire and fire these people, then more likely than not, it's a correct type of control. So it is really important. And if your bylaws are not drafted correctly, and or your operating agreement is not drafted correctly, it could be really not a good thing. And also, I'm an advocate for women businesses, and I've seen a lot in 35 years. And I was just at a conference, and this guy comes up to me and another woman. I had a booth, and we're sitting together. It was a federal conference, and he's got this big name tag on it, and it says "woman-owned business." And he's like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And my girlfriend and I looked at it. It was like, who's I? I mean, I said, I just looked at him. And I said, because I'm old and I could say this to people. Where's the woman? Where is she? Oh, she's home. And then we just looked at each other. So, he had the title of president, but, I'm not sure how he was getting away with that. In context is that you are a WBE certified, and I know many of you are on this program. You want to protect those certifications. You worked hard for it, and it's not fair that other companies are getting certified when they're not woman-owned and controlled, because you do play by the rules.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, in your experience, sort of how far in advance does it make sense to be planning about succession, specifically within the context of certification? What is the more successful stories?
I find 5 years normally is a good time to start thinking about it. But during COVID, everybody expedited. I have so many changes of ownership and so many M&A transactions we did to keep the continuity of ownership, or to actually give new ownership. Like, for instance, a male-owned company. I'm sorry, a female-owned company wanted to do succession, but she didn't have any women in her company, but she had a son who was veteran. So we said, okay, well, then we'll go after the veteran certifications, because there's plenty of opportunities in the supplier diversity market as well as the private or public market. I think that owners that fail to plan, they're gonna fail. I've seen owners, and one was a wonderful WBENC person. She called me at a convention like 3 years ago, and she said, Michelle, I'm going out of business. I can't deal with the unions, et cetera, and I have no one to sell to, because she didn't start looking, and people say, where can I find buyers? Or, here's my recommendation. You find buyers through your accountants and your attorneys and your bankers, because all of us know who wants to buy and sell companies. And it's amazing how much your accountants will know. I mean, they're all very ethical, and they wouldn't, disclose unless there was allowed disclosure. But that's a really good way. And if you're looking to your employees, start asking them the hard questions. Do you have the money to pay for this? How will you finance this? You know, let's get this going and let's start it, like you say, a two-step process. I love doing it in a step process. There's a continuity of ownership, and that right now we have a woman who's fighting with the Department of Transportation. It was a woman to a woman, but she worked there for 2 years when she bought into the company, and in steps, she bought into the company. And that woman mentored her for 2 years daily. She mentored her. She took her out to projects. She did the bidding with her, the estimating with her, and everything else. And we put the woman into classes, and then it was a more seamless transition. So, you know, I don't know if you want to go 10 years out, because lots of stuff could happen in 10 years, but I suggest at least 3 to 5 years out, especially if you're looking to sell at a good price to outside parties.
Yeah. And that's obviously consistent with what we've heard so far, right? Just even in general, whether if you don't care about certification at all. Amanda asks, how can companies offer ownership to males and maintain certification? Is there any path? And let me just say one little thing and then ask Michelle to comment more expansively. You know, if we're talking about minority ownership, it's not necessarily a problem from a WBENC perspective, as long as a couple things are true. First is, again, we're back to those darn bylaws. You know, none of you, I'm sure, woke up this morning thinking, wow, the first thing I want to do today after my coffee is to read my bylaws. I'm guessing Michelle didn't want to do that first thing, and she's a lawyer, right? But if the bylaws allow, you know, decisions to be made by a majority of the owners, you know, majority of the ownership interest, majority of the holders of stock, whatever, then it's probably not a problem, right? If the men own 49% or less. But the other thing is then, what is the role of the man, right? So we've had situations, not necessarily in the context of a transition, but just in terms of applicants, where a man owns 49% of the company and 2 or 3 women own the 51% split, right? So sure, that meets the ownership test. It may even meet the legal control test, depending on how the bylaws are written. But then we look at, it's like, who's really running the business then? I mean, maybe it's the woman, one of the women, maybe not. So, you know, the ownership piece is very black and white. You either own 51% or you don't. I mean, there's not really a lot of nuance in that. The legal control piece is pretty black and white. Your bylaws say what they say. Your shareholder agreements say what they say. It's the operational control and independence that becomes a little bit more subjective and nuanced, right? And, you know, you've all maybe seen this. I mean, you might have a salesperson or salesman who makes more than you do. And from our perspective, that's fine. You know, I mean, and you want him. I mean, you know, Meg is sitting there nodding. Yeah, she wants her sales guys out there making as much money as they possibly can, because they're on commission, and that means she's making money. So that's fine. By itself, it's a data point. But if Meg hires Bob, who's running the company effectively, and Meg is spending all of her time, you know, maybe not in Florida, Meg might choose a different state where her family is. And Meg's no longer involved, and Bob's doing everything, and Bob's making more money. Well, then we start to look at, is Meg really running this business? So it becomes more subjective. But Michelle, do you want to talk about, you know, kind of male ownership in maybe more the context even of government certifications as well?
Well, from a government certification, it normally will raise a red flag as soon as you say there's a change of ownership, because then there's a male involved. And they really want to look at, re-examine the resumes. So let's say you actually took on this male because he is a great salesman, and you're adding a product line that you don't even understand, or you're taking your business into a new direction, and he's got 100% of the expertise and you've got 0 expertise. That could be problematic. So, and they want to know that you at least have the operational control where you can fire him at any time. We've seen, you know, there's a woman whose employee has been adamant that he wants stock, and she does not want to give him stock. So Michelle, what are the other options? Well, the company actually also owns, or she actually owns a building. And maybe she would give him ownership in that building instead, but not in her company, or issuing phantom stock. Phantom stock is not stock. It actually, I don't know why they call it phantom, but it's actually an incentive for employees to stay there, help you grow the company. And then upon the sale, they'll get a certain percentage of the purchase price, but it's upon the sale of the company. That's another way to do that. But you've got to be very careful in when you presenting your change of ownership, what this if it's a male, what this guy brings to the table, and demonstrating in your operating agreement and your bylaws that you can fire and hire him at any time. And be very careful of employment agreements. In that context, a lot of times they'll, that employment agreements as well as shareholder agreements, because those arise too when there's a new person coming into your company, they put negative control on you. For instance, you've got to have the ability to transfer your stock at any time to anyone you please. Now, you could put as much control as you want on the male, the new owner, in terms of his ability to transfer his stock. For instance, you need the right of first refusal, or he's got to, redeem through the company. But and so if he starts saying, no, you can't transfer your stock or sell your stock to somebody else, that's negative control and you get decertified. So that's why you want to, once again, make sure you talk to your trusted advisors before you make these moves.
And from a WBENC perspective, we're okay with the right of first refusal for everyone, as long as there's a process that if the company chooses not to buy it, and then if the other shareholders choose not to buy, then you can sell to whoever you want. I mean, at whatever, market terms, right? So that's a very important point. And frankly, all of you, since you're certified, that should be in place now for you. But again, if you own 100% of the company, there may be stuff going on in your bylaws or your operating agreement that you don't even really think about because we don't care, right? As long as you own 100%, then if 100% of the owners the ownership is required to give permission, then you can do it yourself. Ellen asked a question, Michelle, which is the discussion of operational control, discuss day-to-day control. How is it defined? By the number of hours, the decisions being made, the kind of meetings the female's leading? What are the things that the tangible things you would use to define that?
Well, first of all, one needs to look at the regulations, whether the WOSB regulations or the WBENC regulations, and how they define daily control. Mm-hmm. There's been some recent cases regarding veteran operations where the veterans have gotten mad because they're not in the same city, for instance, which is it seems to be less and less important now after everybody has adjusted to the new way of doing things, remotely. But and so every agency is different, Ellen, and I'm sorry that there's not just a black and white. The Department of Transportation, DBE regulations do define that. They want it, and so do the federal regulations. They say during normal working hours. And so there was one thing where this guy was actually trying to get 8A certification, but he had a little business at nighttime, was working full time at a bank. And I think that's not daily control, right? So if you are on, if you are on it and you know what's going on in your company, even if the larger you get, even if your management team are sending you reports and you're not actually on the floor walking in the warehouses and stuff like that, that's fine. They want to know that and if there's any emergencies, you're the first one to know about it. Those are the types of things where you don't want, think about it, you don't want to be the last one when it comes to anything big, big purchases, big contracts, hiring and firing key personnel. That all should be under your realm and you're the first to go to. And, and as demonstrated on paper, it's normally through your resumes or through the application process itself. But in the long term, if you're ever questioned on it, those are the things I think that both government and WBENC looks at.
Yeah. And WBENC doesn't necessarily, WBENC doesn't have the volumes of regulations that exist on the government side. But some of it, and we haven't mentioned this yet, some of it really has to do with size and scope, right? So, if I'm selling $2 million electrical contracting business, and I'm going to stay on as the chair, my role in that probably needs to be a little bit more frequent, hands-on, or, because a business of that size typically isn't going to have, I mean, leadership in a business like that is more hands-on, right? Because it's a smaller business compared to a $400 million company, right? Where the chair, I mean, the span of control, the bigger the company is, obviously you are further up, right, from the people who are on the ground doing the work. If you have a $300 million construction company, the top leader of that company is not out doing estimating, right? They're certainly not, on site very much. I mean, frankly, if the top leader shows up on site, that's probably a sign of a real problem on that site. Whereas in a, $1 million construction company, the top leader is probably doing all that work, right? Because there's not enough money in that business, pay somebody else to do all of it. So some of it just becomes size and scope and what's appropriate for that size of a business. The CEO of Walgreens is not a pharmacist, right? And that's, nobody doubts that they're in charge of the company. So, whereas if you have a, $500,000 a year little pharmacy store, the owner probably is the pharmacist. I want to ask Michelle another question, sort of shift a little bit here. So one of the ways that you might think about long-term succession planning is by doing some kind of almost like a roll-up, where your business acquires other businesses, either in the context of them being able to sell later or just because you want to acquire other businesses. So Michelle, if a company, a WBE, a certified firm, wants to grow by acquiring other companies that have existing revenue streams, what are the issues that she should be thinking through in terms of certification?
Well, we've done a lot of that, and recently at one of our women business owners has an electrical company and wanted to buy another electrical company. And I said, why? And she said, I need the employees. We're a shortage of labor here and they have existing contracts, right? So and I want that expertise. And that's a way to grow your business. Most important thing is understand why that business is selling their business and do your due diligence. Have your attorneys or whatever look at their contracts. Are they assignable? And also look at their financials, look at their bank lines of credit, look to see if they have liens on any of their assets, things like that. You gotta ask the hard questions. Especially there might be EEO complaints. There could be discrimination complaints that are pending. So so you can acquire a business or you can acquire the assets of the business. When you acquire a business, you're requiring, which a lot of people do in the federal world, because you're acquiring their past performance. And it's a seamless thing. There's something called, you don't even need a novation because you're acquiring the entire EIN number, but you're also acquiring their liabilities. If you're only just acquiring their assets, most people want to just acquire contracts and employees. And that's an asset sale in which you wouldn't be taking on the other company's liabilities. Whether that other company stays afloat and they do something else, or they end up dissolving, it's just a sale of assets. And there are a lot of pros and cons to each one of them. But that's what the first thing we ask our client when they want to sell their company or they want to buy a company, is this going to be an asset sale or a stock sale? Because there's a lot of different structure considerations as well as tax considerations.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the word novation, and can you define that when it comes up? Because this would be important whether you're buying a business or in the context of you're selling the business. What is this novation of which you speak, and why does it matter?
Well, in the commercial world, it's called an assignment. So if you've got a contract with AT&T or Ford or a Target company, you probably most contracts have an anti-assignment clause, meaning you just can't. They hired you. They don't want to. You end up giving that work to somebody else. Okay, but in the government, whether it's the state of Minnesota or the city of Minneapolis or the federal government, they have something called novation when you're buying somebody's or you're selling your contracts. And it's a process whereby the government agrees to substitute those parties, saying, okay, my company is called ABC. I'm selling my contracts, and my employees are all transferring over to XYZ. I put together, and here's an ovation contract, Department of Army or Air Force or Department of State, and here's an ovation agreement. Here's how it makes sense, and that this new party that's going to be taking over these contracts have the expertise. They're maybe it's an architecture firm to another architecture firm, but they have the ability to complete those projects. And because the government also has an anti-assignment clause, and that's why they require an ovation. They require an ovation when there's a sale of assets. They don't require an ovation when it's a stock sale or an equity sale.
And those novation agreements can take a long time. And during that time, it may be difficult or impossible to continue to sell. I mean, I worked for a company in Indiana that was a defense contractor, and an investor group. This had nothing to do with certification, but it had everything to do with novation. The investor group purchased assets from the seller. It was the same factory. It was the same people. I mean, it was just, all of a sudden it had a different owner, but it was an asset sale. And we ended up having to sell product through a third party for a while that had a cage code, because we didn't have, we had to transfer the cage code. Was not just something we could decide with the seller, right? The government had to approve it. And so those are the kinds of things you want to really have some good counsel on if you are relying on government contracts, federal contracts, or other government contracts for a significant amount of money.
Then I've seen the novation process also go very fast and smooth.
Okay, good. Good.
And I mean, really fast, because
we didn't know what we were doing, so that probably didn't help.
Well, they want a continuity. And so it's the package that you and your advisor puts together, and we babysit them. And the best thing I've done with them is we contact the agency, we have them contact the contracting officer, tell them what the proposed transaction is going to say and do. And then it's more seamless, and it can go fairly fast.
I think the issue that we had was that we were doing spares and repairs. And so we had a bunch of little contracts. You know what I mean? We weren't performing on, something, and we weren't going to stop the Ford assembly line if we stopped supplying product. So are there other kinds of concerns, Michelle, that government contractors, I'm kind of looking at a list of questions we put together, of government of government contractors that are some specific, like 8A or, things like that. What do you need to think about with that?
Well, if any of you have 8A or had 8A in the past, you'll know this, but if you're 8A and it's only a 9-year program, and so when a lot of 8A contractors are planning 2 or 3 years in advance, and they do a lot of really smart stuff. One thing they do is try to get what they call an IDIQ contract, which is a long-term, potentially 5 to 10-year contract that won't expire even though you're no longer 8A anymore. Same thing with woman-owned business. So there's a continuity of those contracts. So that's one thing they do. The other thing they do is they look to mentor other firms. They look to mentor other 8A or other small businesses, because in the federal contracting market, if you go into a mentor protege program with a small business, and they're in all categories, it could be woman-owned, veteran-owned, 8A, hub-zoned, et cetera, or just small business, you can be their mentor. You could joint venture on small business set-asides, and you could be that 50% or the 49% partner. And the SBA allows an equity investor to own up to 40% of your company without affiliation. So you can potentially own 40% of another company that you're mentoring, and you could see the revenues that you may have lost when you're no longer a small business. And then a lot of just small businesses look to team with each other, joint venture with each other, and team, not just in the federal market, but in the supplier diversity market. I was up in, I think it was Michigan, and I think Cynthia may have been there too. I believe it was at the Federal Reserve Bank where Ford Motors was speaking, and they were talking about this whole notion of joint venturing, the 2 women businesses joint venturing with each other, that they had their own mentor protege program. So those are the types of things that you want to look to. But if you're selling your 8A business, the best thing you do is sell it to another 8A, because then there'll be a continuity of those contracts. If not, you're going to have to ask the government, which I've done in 3 different instances this past 6 months, for what they call a waiver. Because when the owner of an 8A contractor, meaning you as a disadvantaged woman-owned business, sells your company to another, those 8A contracts immediately terminate. It's unless you get a waiver asking the SBA and the agencies not to terminate those contracts. So, and you have to do it in advance of the sale.
So I think that if you hear nothing else, that sentence, do it in advance of the sale, probably, it kind of applies to everything, right? Many problems, and I think about this electrical contractor who transferred to her daughter-in-law. It was very seamless. Had she just, transferred to this woman and not trained the woman and not done the 2-step process, it would have been a whole different outcome, and it wouldn't have been as positive. We've talked around the topic of ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, in our previous sessions. And we are planning to have a program with some people talking about how you do an ESOP, right? But essentially, to sort of get to the bottom, and what I want to talk with Michelle about is the ramifications for certification. You really are transferring ownership to a group of employees, right? So there's all kinds of tax reasons why you might do that. It is a complex process. You should not do it on your own. And we will be having more discussion of that at a later time. But Michelle, if a company does sell to an ESOP, how does that play out on the government side, at least? And then we can talk about WBENC as well.
Well, it's first of all, ESOPs are a great way to transfer ownership to your employees, because it's a way it gets financed. So the whole financing, so your employees can't afford it, right? But in the certification world, in the federal contracting world, as well as I believe various state and municipalities, say that the stock has to be owned by U.S. citizens, and an ESOP is not a U.S. citizen. Mm-hmm. And so in that situation, what is allowable is that the women business owner continue to own, or at least a group of women business owners continue to own at least 51% of the stock, then the other 49% of the stock can go into an ESOP. And that's acceptable on the federal level. And so that's what I would recommend. And that could be a way to not only transition your business to the point where it goes total ESOP, but also to get money into your pocket as well to start your succession planning and retirement process.
Yeah. It's on the WBENC side, obviously, if you do what Michelle said, which is you continue to have 51% owned by, actual human women, you wouldn't have a WBENC problem. But even if you transition the entire company to WBENC, or the entire company to an ESOP, what we really do is look at a list of the people in the ESOP, right? And are women, if everybody has an equal share, it's, are there 51% of that list of names female? Or if the ownership is varied, then we would add up, so from an analysis point of view, we don't look at an ESOP being any different than just a list of a bunch of, owners of 1 or 2% of the company. But then we also look at who's in charge of the ESOP, who makes decisions for the ESOP itself. So in that way, it is more complex, right?
In that situation, though, especially if you're a larger company, and especially nowadays, employees come and go. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden you might be in compliance with that 51%, where you have 12 women business owners, but 2 of them want to go off and start their own company or retire. And now you're out of, you're out of compliance. And so there could be continuing notice of changes to WBENC. I don't know how many of your all in the audience, how many of your employees have come and gone in the last year, but my clients experience a lot. So that's the hard part of trying to keep that 51% ownership at all times by a group of people.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it does become a challenge. If you're in an industry, just to be, that is largely female, then it's less of a risk than it might be if you're in an industry that tends to have more male workers in it. So Michelle, I guess I would also just say to folks, if you have any other questions, please either put them in the chat, or if they're the kind of things that are easier to just say, you know, take yourself off mute. I'm going to put my link to schedule like just a personal appointment if you have specific, you know, yes, I'm thinking of doing this in 3 years and really want to talk through some ideas. You know, I'm happy to do that, and we can have those conversations obviously offline. But if you have other questions now and want to take yourself off mute, please do.
One of the things I want to say also is you always want to seek permission than ask forgiveness. So in SBA is really tight on that. You know, if you don't notify them of the proposed change of ownership in certain certification contexts, especially 8A, you'll lose your certification, because if it's proposed in their mind, it's exercised. So, and you have to worry about letters of intent. Is a letter of intent going to be deemed exercised by DBE agencies or other WBE agencies? And with respect to WBENC, some of my clients, the largest, more sophisticated ones that have these M&A attorneys that they're bringing with them, they'll say, this is what we plan to do. And I'll say, you're not going to be able to do it. You know, what we can do is we'll talk with WBENC and schedule a call with them, tell them about these proposed transaction terms, and you can hear it from them. So once again, that's a way of getting permission, so to speak. It's not necessarily permission because they want to see the final documents before they'll make that decision. But you know, God forbid you should make these ownership changes, and the next thing you know, your $20 million enterprise goes down the tube because you didn't know that something like this could actually impact your certification.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way that it works in the WBENC certification world is, you know, we can have conversations with you and we can, you know, review some documents in advance and say, hey, there's a red flag, or this is going to be okay and this is not going to be okay. But then you go through the process. But our goal is to avoid bumps in that process, or at least to let you know, yeah, this isn't going to work. We had a very large WBE, or have a very large WBE, they remain certified, that was owned by the family, which was all women. And you know, they wanted to get some liquidity out, right? Because all of their wealth, which was frankly considerable, was tied up in this business. And so they brought in a strategic investor, and that all made sense. And there were some real nuanced details that we were able to work out with them that came down to put and call rights. I mean, it was really, it took a while to get there, but we were able to get there. I don't know that what we agreed to with them is something that a government certifier would have approved, frankly. They weren't government certified. It didn't make any difference in their industry. So it, you know, that was a non-issue. But had they
that's why I like WBENC, because you know, WBENC will have a conversation, and WBENC is very user-friendly to their WBEs, whereby the SBA will only do that with 8A contractors. Any other, you know, the city of Chicago, the city of LA, the city of Minneapolis, they're not going to tell you ahead of time whether they would allow it. They just don't take those meetings at all. Yeah. And so that's why you need a trusted advisor that understands the rules of certification, because once you pull the trigger, it's sometimes impossible to go back, or you could lose the certification. But so get, you know, or even another area is going to your PTACs, and they can at least tell you, ooh, you've got a legal issue, or ooh, you need to contact the WBDC and, you know, in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and talk to them about this and ask them first and tell them what you're proposing.
Yeah, it's making assumptions about your certification, or, you know, I own 100% of the company now and I'm going to sell it to Meg, you know, she's a woman. So that should work, right? So I'm going to just go ahead and do that. No. And once it happens, depending on, I mean, again, if I bring in a male investor, then I'm given 60 days to correct the problems, which I may or may not be able to do at that point, right? We've talked about that. But if I sell my interest, or maybe, Meg and I own the company 50-50, whatever, and we both sell 100% to Terry, whatever, as long as we're having that 100% transfer, then that's, the certification lapses, and then you have to start over. Now, Terry might be able to get certified in the business that she buys from Meg and Karen. That might be fine, but she's still got to go through the full certification process, which, as you know, is not, maybe desirable. You're better off with just being able to do a material change. So,
Karen, and I have two comments on that. And this is the best example I can give. I can buy a structural engineering firm, or Ellen's firm, an AE firm, and it could be, I could truly buy it and truly have 100% ownership, but I don't have an architecture license. I don't have a structural engineer license, and I have no ability to control my workers because I don't know what they're doing. I don't have that expertise. And so, just because you may have been, owned a milk company, and now you want to buy a structural engineering firm, it doesn't mean you're going to get certified. And one other point, which is totally out there, but I forgot to mention, is that I'm finding that private equity firms and just other, Native American firms, other businesses that buy businesses are looking to do earnouts, right? They don't want to pay you in advance. They want to give you a little money down front. They want a long-term promissory note. You got to be really careful about long-term promissory notes, because you're going to have to be on that for a long time and just, praying that they're not going to default on that note. But that, one of the things. And the other, in earnouts, that's when, the company basically pays out over time. It pays you out over time if the company's successful. It also means that if it's a woman to a woman company, there's going to be negative control in those earnouts. And so you got to be very careful and understand that whenever there's an earnout agreement, like a shareholder agreement, it will raise huge red flags with WBENC and with any kind of government agency.
Amanda has a question, and then Terry is going to come off mute, but let me ask Amanda's first. What type of documentation needs to be submitted for a material change? What I'll say from a WBENC perspective is really whatever would document that transaction. So, Amanda, if you own 100% of the company and you sell 2% of it to Susie Q, we would need the proof of the sale, however that was documented, and then information about Susie, right? So she's female, what's her resume, that kind of thing. Michelle, on the government side, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about what you see as necessary?
Yeah, very much. We put together packages for our clients when there's a change of ownership, and that includes the proof of purchase or how that transferred, whether by assignment, maybe it was through inheritance, whatever that is. We'll show that. We'll put a new stock ledger together with a new unit ledger, the resumes, any other capabilities. Potentially this woman has certain OSHA certifications, or other, the new woman owner has various expertise we want to bring out, and we want to explain how we put together a narrative letter about how, okay, I own 100% of the ownership. I was sole director. I was president, secretary. Now I've got my two daughters, and they each own blank percent. And they're now on the board of directors. They are now secretaries, vice presidents, and just spell it out what the ownership looked like before the change and what the ownership and control looked like, after the change, with various supporting documentation.
Yeah. Michelle had said something that I had wanted to comment on as well, specifically with respect to licenses. She made the kind of example of herself buying an A&E firm. If there are professional licenses, I don't mean a business license with the city of Chicago, but I mean a professional license that is needed in order for your business to operate. And specifically, that would be an architecture license. That's kind of the classic case. But it would, if you're in the real estate industry, you need to be the managing broker. Those licenses have to be held by at least one woman in the organization, right? So, Ellen, if you are selling your business to, let's just say, 3 employees, okay, 2 women and a man, whatever, they each get a third, but the man is the one with the architecture license, that's going to be really problematic. Now, it's fine if he has one, as long as one of the other women does too, right? And so you want to just, those kinds of things are potentially significant. That
they are, and unlike like Illinois, other states actually make you have licenses for almost everything, you know, and especially in construction, and they want to know that if, for instance, the males in the company are the only ones that have the license, that has to do with independence. You can't independently have your company, and it's not a viable business if these 2 guys walk away.
Right.
You know, you can't legally, you cannot run that company, and that's what the agencies look at.
Yeah, Terry, go ahead now. You've been waiting. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, this is for either Karen. This is for you or Michelle. Just, it's kind of along the same lines from a best practice standpoint. Whether you're selling to another certified company or not, when's a good time to let your customers know?
Terry, go ahead.
For me, I think it has to do with the relationships you have with your customers. And a lot of times, obviously you don't want your customers to know, because they could like start looking somewhere else for business, right? They could like jump on you, right? So it really depends on the relationship you have with your customers. And then also I would bring them along and introduce them to your customers. And this is going to be the prospective buyer. And, you know, and how do you feel about, you know, I mean, just whatever, even over a coffee. So I don't know if there's a right and wrong answer. That really depends on the nature of the relationship with your customers. Are your customers close enough where you're golfing and going to dinner with them? Or are they this big corporate entity that probably wouldn't even pay attention? You know, AT&T, I don't know if they would really care that much unless you're in their crucial operations.
Yeah, and I think you also want to make sure that you know the deal's going to close. Because, you know, if you say to your customer, hey, I'm thinking of selling to so-and-so, and, you know, and then all of a sudden, you know, 3 months later, your customer says, hey, whatever happened to that, you know, deal? You're still around. What's going on? And you say, well, it didn't close. I mean, that looks unstable, frankly. And why didn't it close? What did they find in due diligence? Is that something that the customer needs to be worried about? So I think you want to make sure that happens. You know, we talked a little bit about kind of the consulting agreement, post-sale types of things in the previous episodes of this program, and that's really part of that post-sale role, right? That you would go introduce Susie to your customers and say, you know, I'm so excited. Susie has all this great experience and she's going to do such a great job for you. And this is why everything is fine. Now, I mean, if it is that kind of relationship, back on Michelle's point earlier about novation and assignment, I mean, if there's an actual contract that you have with your customer, then that contract is going to have some kind of process that you would need to do, as opposed to just, you know, introducing the person. And it just depends on the nature of the business. If you're on kind of a PO type of business, then really the more informal thing would be the way to handle it. But I would really wait until the sale is consummated, because you can get to 2 days before closing and all of a sudden something blows up, and it's almost by definition something you didn't see coming.
Karen, I wanted to make a comment about consulting agreements. So let's say you are acquiring a business from a male, and part of that acquisition is that transitioning, and you have a 1-year consulting agreement with them or something like that. That's a real red flag to agencies. However, if it's a woman to woman, it's not going to be a problem. But for some of you, not only want to, you're looking for buyers, but you're saying, how can I finance this transaction? So you actually want to give buyers the ideas of how to so we talked about promissory notes, we talked about earnouts, but there's also something else called SBA financing. And SBA financing, and this is one more nuance of the different agency rules. So with the SBA financing, you can use money, I believe it's up to $5 million, and take that money and pay off your other partner. So now you're the sole owner, or you could use it to acquire another business, or they can use it to acquire you, right? So it's great. It's a great way of financing this. They do allow consulting agreements with the prior owners, but only, I believe it's either 6 months or 1 year. And then because they don't want to see long-term consulting agreements. A woman came to me out of Colorado, and she said, Michelle, we got these, we can't get certified. Can you help us? And so I said, well, how do you come to ownership? Well, we did it through SBA financing. And so I own the company, and then 41% males. We got it through my father, but through financing through SBA. Well, the DOT said, wait a second. So it's a small business loan. So the loan has to go through to a small business. And so therefore, it was that small business that was paying off the old owner. And the Department of DBE regulations say, no, you didn't pay for that stock. It was paid through by the SBA loan, and your company is making the debt service payments on that loan. Whereby WBENC is okay that there's SBA financing, because they know that there's personal liability on the part of those women, right, in terms of paying that debt if it's not paid off.
Well, and it's a privately held company. I mean, it's your money at the end of the day, right? I mean, it's not, but it is important to distinguish between what the government certifiers look at. Kind of on that topic as we start to wrap up, but Michelle, do you see, so one of the ways of selling a business would be to sell to a holding company, right? So that, and when I'm going to define holding company really specifically here, which is a company that exists to do nothing else than to own other businesses. So, it's Berkshire Hathaway or something, right? I mean, there's 5 guys in Omaha, and that's the holding company. So if you're selling to a holding company, how does that impact government certifications? We're going to assume that the holding company itself is not Berkshire Hathaway, that it is a female-controlled enterprise, right? But Michelle, how does that work on the government side?
If it's a female-controlled enterprise, so for instance, you're selling your stock to a holding company, and that holding company is certified as a WBE, that wouldn't be necessarily a problem. Mm-hmm. With WBENC, with Department of Transportation, parent subsidiaries are okay as long as the parent serves a commercially useful function, and the parent is owned and controlled by women or disadvantaged owners. If the holding company is simply a shell and a holding company, they won't allow the certification. And then in the WOSB federal world, because the company is not owned by U.S. citizens, but is owned by a holding company, it won't work at all.
Yeah. When we look at, from a WBENC perspective, when we do our analysis, we look to see, is the holding company majority owned by women? Is it controlled by women? I mean, we don't certify a holding company, but our analysis is basically the same as, right? So if Cook Enterprises, which doesn't really do anything other than own other companies, is owned by Meg, controlled by Meg, then that's great. And Cook Enterprises owns Acme Operating Company, then that would be fine. But to Michelle's point, not for the WOSB, because it has to be directly owned by a human, so a U.S. citizen human. So do we have any last questions as we wrap up? Michelle, do you have any last words of wisdom for the group?
I wrote a couple notes down, if we, depending on that, and it's just the really advanced planning, and you want to advance plan with, for instance, if it's going to be family succession, you want to plan with your family and keep your kids apprised of what's going on, because you don't want uncomfortable conversations at Thanksgiving table, right? And that, it's like one, so for instance, wow, I really want to give my ownership to my daughters, but what about the sons? So is there anything else you can give to the sons, through money or maybe real estate or something like that, where it's fair to them? So you want, and then a lot of parents, I've had a lot of parents come to me that I've represented for years, and they're like, my son or my daughter does not want to be part of this, part of my company. I'm devastated. I want this legacy. So start having those conversations and try getting them involved if you want them to be in your succession plan and taking over the company. And then also include your accountants in that in those conversations, or tax advisors and your trusted attorneys or other professionals with certification experience, because you could have some business advisors, and there's a lot out there, they could have brilliant ideas as to how this is going to work, but and then you find out that you're going to lose your certification or you can never get certified. So I would keep the planning with your trusted advisors in advance.
Yep, thank you. And Mary Jane just had asked for kind of a reiteration on the discussion of transitioning ownership to males. And really, again, women have to remain in control of the business. Women have to own 51% or more of the business. Women have to have the legal control based on the documentation, the bylaws, the operating agreement, shareholder agreements, what have you. And women have to then be in charge of the day-to-day operation of the business. They have to have the highest officer title in the business. They have to be overseeing the affairs of the business. And then the business has to be independent of non-female owned, whether that's male owned or if it's some corporate or whatever. So hopefully that becomes a little bit more clear. We'll be sending this out to everybody, and we really appreciate your attendance and participation. And Michelle, thank you so much. Michelle is also
Michelle,
on the board of the WBENC, so she is an enormous friend of the WBENC. And here's our contact information. We will be sending this out following the webinar along with the recording. And as I mentioned, now that everything is all done, we're going to get it put on our website as well. So I think let's just make sure that I don't have any other things to say. I do want to thank Michelle from McDonald's Hopkins, and I want to thank our sponsors, Barnes and Thornburg and Eisner Amper, for their leadership in this program as well. And wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I know.
Bye-bye.